Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Stedman. Thank you all so much for being here today. As the lovely introduction suggested, I'm here to talk about the intersection of atheism and interfaith work, and specifically why I think it's valuable for atheists to engage in interfaith efforts. But before I get into that, I want to share a little bit of my backstory, because I actually grew up in a non-religious household. In fact, our household was really irreligious. I didn't hear the word God growing up, but I didn't hear the word atheism either. But when I was around 11 years old, I experienced a radical conversion and became a born-again Christian. And there were two things that preceded that experience. The first was that about a year prior, I started reading books like Roots, Hiroshima, The Diary of Anne Frank, works that really exposed me to a lot of the injustice that occurred in the world, and not only sort of informed me that it happened, like my history books did as a child, but humanized the experience, sort of embodied these experiences with stories. And I was trying to find a way to make sense of that. The second thing that really sort of set the scene for my conversion was that my parents separated, and my family dynamic was disrupted. It changed very significantly. And when some friends invited me to attend an evangelical Christian youth group, the group really sort of stepped in and provided a lot of the structure that my family had provided prior to that point. So it all seemed pretty great for about a moment, but very shortly after I converted, I realized something I sort of had always known but had struggled to really put my finger on, and that is that I am a gay man. And right away, I knew that this was going to be a problem. And I really struggled with this for a number of years. It was a very challenging period in my life. But eventually, I made my way into more progressive Christian communities after my mom found a journal that I kept detailing my struggles around my sexual orientation. I have a really sort of cheesy sense of humor, so I like to say that I ended up coming out of the closet because my actual closet was messy. And it's true, my mom was sort of sorting through my piles of stuff, found this journal I kept, and directed me to see a progressive Christian minister, which really turned my life in a whole new direction. And I'm very grateful for what she did. So I became more involved in progressive Christian communities and began to rationalize the negative experiences I had had around my sexual orientation and my religious beliefs by imagining that God was sort of preparing me to work in solidarity with the disenfranchised and the marginalized, that the struggles I had experienced were God's way of sort of helping me intimately understand the experience of suffering so that I could work with others who suffered. So I decided I wanted to go into the ministry, and I went to university to study religion. Now, when I went to university to study religion, I learned a lot about religion, a lot that I didn't know prior to my conversion, like how the Christian scriptures came to be. Those were things I was not taught in my church. But more than anything, I was actually encouraged by my Christian professors to explore the roots and origins of my beliefs and the underpinning desires that had propelled me into Christianity in the first place. And when I realized it had been about a desire for community and about looking for an ethical framework to make sense of injustice, and that the theological commitments of Christianity had never sat as comfortably with me, they'd always felt a bit alien, especially given my sort of non-religious roots. My Christian beliefs, dissolved relatively quickly. I sort of took a look at the evidence for the existence of God and found that for me it didn't make sense. But because we live in a world that's in many ways defined by either or, us and them, right and wrong, I didn't know how to be anything but religious or totally opposed to religious expression. I remained a religious studies major, but I wanted to look at religion as a purely academic subject, a problem to be resolved, something that I could sort of study from afar, observe, but not really participate in. My conflicted feelings on religion spilled over into my personal life, and I found it difficult to talk about religion with other people who were religious without it immediately devolving into an argument where both myself and the other person merely recited our positions at one another without actually listening to one another. So I would alternate between arguing with my religious classmates and just avoiding discussions of the role of religion in people's lives altogether. I worked I volunteered several days a week with a community center that served a lot of Somali immigrants in Minneapolis, the majority of whom were Muslim. And anytime anything around their religious beliefs came up, I would change the subject. I just didn't know how to talk about religious differences, and so I tried to avoid the subject altogether. After college, some of that resistance began to break down because of experiences that I had with religious individuals, where I was forced to sort of challenge a lot of the notions I held about religion as a sort of static, problematic thing. And around that time, I was introduced to this idea of interfaith work. So interfaith work, as I understand it, is an effort to humanize religious diversity, to put faces and stories on these identities that we hear about, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, atheist, to put people who hold these identities into the same room and give them the opportunity to break down a lot of the misunderstanding that may exist. It's work that intentionally strives to build bridges between people of different backgrounds in a hope to sort of uncover some common ground, some shared experiences. And it also suggests that once that common ground is found, we can use it to move into shared values-based action, that we can build coalitions and use them to address important social issues. I was exposed to this idea through a book called Acts of Faith by a man named Ibu Patel, who I went on to work with in Chicago through the Interfaith Youth Corps. And I'd like to share just a quick excerpt from that book right now. In the book, he writes, 100 years ago, the great African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois famously said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. I believe that the 21st century will be shaped by the question of the faith line." On one side of the faith line are the religious totalitarians. Their conviction is that only one interpretation of one religion is a legitimate way of being, believing, and belonging on earth. Everyone else needs to be cowed or converted or condemned or killed. On the other side of the faith line are the pluralists who hold that people believing in different creeds and belonging to different communities need to learn to live together. Religious pluralism is neither mere coexistence, nor is it forced consensus. It is a form of proactive cooperation that affirms the identity of the constituent communities while emphasizing that the well-being of each and all depends on the health of the whole. So if interfaith work looks at religious differences with this critical eye, it also seeks to address religious conflicts by addressing tribalism, totalitarianism, and extremism, instead of viewing religious diversity through this clash of civilizations lens, which suggests that religious differences must end in conflict and violence. These are the messages that we will often hear in the media, religion versus secularism, Islam versus the West. And it proposes that these differences can be overcome by addressing the tribalistic origins of the conflict. But when people hear this term interfaith, which is sort of what's in fashion in the United States when talking about this kind of work that brings people of different religious and non-religious backgrounds together for common action and common dialogue, the word kind of conjures a number of different images for some people that I think are not representative of what the work actually looks like. People might hear the word interfaith and think a kumbaya or a drum circle. They might think it's a sort of consensus or a no criticism club, right, where religious criticism is sort of off limits. They might think that it's a place that bolsters faith, where faith gets all the credit, where faith is seen as sort of superior. It might be seen as something that makes atheism a religion. In order to fit into this, model, you have to sort of say that atheism is a religion and that it's just another way of seeing the world. I have found from my experiences in doing this work that these concerns they rarely come up, if at all. But I think the risk is higher that those things might be true if atheists are not participating. I think by participating in interfaith work, atheists destroy any religious privilege that might be there, a sort of assumed religiosity. And they can ensure that interfaith acknowledges the very real differences that exist between different religious traditions and between the religious and the non-religious. Ultimately, interfaith is about allowing people to be unapologetic and honest about who they are and what they believe. It may be imperfect terminology, but it is how these efforts are being termed for the time being, and so I always try to encourage atheists to get involved in the efforts and help change the language from within. There are 4 reasons in particular that I think it's especially important that atheists are involved in these efforts, and I want to run through them really quickly. I want to acknowledge that these are sort of US-centric. I work in the United States, so I've been learning a bit about how the application is a little different here in Australia, and I'd be very interested to hear more feedback from any of you. But the first reason is that atheists are hugely outnumbered. While religion today looks very different than it has in the past, it's obvious that religion isn't about to vanish off the face of the earth. This is especially true in the United States. There was a Pew study in 2010 of American millennials that found that the intensity of belief among young religious millennials is actually as strong today as among previous generations, but all the more, levels of certainty of belief in God have actually increased, and religious millennials, or folks who were born in the 80s and 90s, are more inclined than their elders to believe their own religion is the one true path to eternal life. Sociologists once predicted that religion would decline as a result of modernization, but the opposite phenomenon has occurred as religious movements have grown in leaps and bounds in the United States and in many parts of the world, and the majority of these sociologists have retracted their predictions. Peter Berger has written that most sociologists of religion have looked at the world and concluded that the secularization theory, that is, the thesis that modernization necessarily leads to the decline of religion, does not fit the facts of the matter. Another reason why this is so important is, we hear a lot in the United States of the growing sort of religiously unaffiliated. 15% of the American public is religiously unaffiliated, and 29% of 18 to 29-year-olds do not identify with any religion. But the most recent numbers available say that less than 2% of those, less than 2% of the American public identify as atheist, agnostic, humanist, skeptic, and so on. So the numbers remain incredibly small. So for this reason, I think it's very important that atheists get involved in interfaith work. Just about a week ago, I was on the border of Minnesota and North Dakota, way up in the middle of nowhere, and I met a young atheist woman when I was there doing a speech, and she said that for a long time she's felt very isolated and alone, but it was through the interfaith work that she's done in that region that she was able to find people who could accept her for who she was as an atheist. The second reason why I think it's important for atheists to get involved in interfaith work is many atheists I know and hear from have a strong desire to see an end to religiously based extremism and oppression. And the interfaith movement is in itself inherently rooted in an anti-fundamentalism framework. So I think joining our efforts with the interfaith movement's efforts to address and combat religious extremism will make our effort or our reach that much greater. There's a book called Ethnic Conflict in Civic Life, Hindus and Muslims in India, that talks about a lot of the conflicts between Hindu and Muslim communities in India. And in it, it's noted that the likelihood that inciting events will lead to widespread or long-term violence is significantly less in communities where Muslims and Hindus were intentional about reaching out to one another and building relationships of understanding. But in populations where these ties were non-existent, where people didn't strive to build these relationships, inciting incidents provoked extensive inter-identity violence. So interfaith work seeks to sort of root out religious fundamentalism and tribalism by humanizing diversity, and it can be a really great tool in the fight against these things. The third reason is that interfaith is an educational project. The United States is the most religiously diverse nation in the history of the world. But it's also, religious illiteracy is rampant in the United States. People know very little about religion, about their own beliefs, about other people's beliefs. Interfaith work sets out to be a project that educates people about religious diversity. Carl Sagan once wrote, "Every one of us is, in the cosmic perspective, precious. If a human disagrees with you, let him live. In 100 billion galaxies, you will not find another." While I agree with the underlying principle of that sentiment, I'd like to go a step further. I don't want to just let those who disagree with me live. I actually want to go out of my way to try to befriend and understand them. Sure enough, some of my greatest insights have grown out of these relationships. In E Pluribus Unum, Diversity in Community in the 21st Century, Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam wrote that diversity is actually important for building strong and sustainable communities, that it's actually a strength and an asset. But at least at first, when confronted with diversity, people tend to hunker down with those who are very similar to themselves and gaze upon newcomers with suspicion. So in order for diversity, including religious diversity, to be an asset to our communities, people have to meet and learn from one another under intentional bridge-building type of circumstances. This has been very true of my work with the Muslim community in the United States. I've done a lot of outreach into the Muslim community, and as a result of my advocacy, I've had many Muslims come to me and ask how they can advocate for me as an atheist and as a queer person. And a lot of these are individuals who profess that they had never really had a relationship with anyone who identified as either of those in the past. Finally, the fourth reason is that in the United States and in many other places, atheists have a very bad reputation and experience significant marginalization. You know, in the United States, atheists represent a very small sliver of the population and are seen in many studies that it's shown that they're seen in a very negative light. And so I think that building these relationships will do a lot to undo a lot of that. There was a poll in 2010 done by Gallup that found that people are significantly more inclined to oppose gay marriage if they don't know anyone who's gay. Similarly, studies have found that in the United States, 46% of Americans think that Islam is more violent than other faiths, and 55% of Americans claim to know not very much or nothing at all about Islam. But only 37% of Americans claim to even know a Muslim American, let alone have a positive relationship with one. So to me, the disconnect is clear when only 37% of Americans even know a Muslim American and 55% claim to know nothing or very little about Islam. The negative stereotypes that pervade about the Muslim community in the United States go unchallenged. I think the same logic of these figures can be extended to atheists. The more relationships we have with those who do not identify as atheists, the more opportunities we'll have to challenge a lot of the stereotypes that exist. This is one example of this is my mom. She goes to a gym in rural Minnesota, and she says that when she is talking to someone she doesn't know at the gym and they ask about her children, she has no problem saying that my upcoming book is about, you know, my being gay, about my doing interfaith work and working with Muslims. But when she gets to the atheist part, her voice catches in her throat, and she has to sort of force herself to go on because she knows and has seen a lot of the reactions that gets from people, and she doesn't want them to judge her child in advance. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in challenging a lot of those misconceptions and stereotypes that exist. The last of these reasons, the fourth, is one reason why I find some of the discourse around atheism to be a bit problematic these days, because I think it directly contributes to a lot of these problems. You know, the discussion between the religious and the non-religious in the sort of broader cultural perspective has come to be seen as two very generalizing extreme positions talking past one another, much like the Q&A, some feedback I heard about the Q&A. And it has resulted in this huge chasm between the religious and the non-religious. And I think many people in this room are aware that, you know, many in the religious community are very guilty of this. But I think that among atheists, we have some reflecting to do ourselves. I'm going to quote Carl Sagan again because he's one of my favorites. He wrote once that the chief deficiency I see in the skeptical movement is its polarization, us versus them, the sense that we have a monopoly on the truth, that those other people who believe in all these stupid doctrines are morons, that if you're sensible, you'll listen to us, and if not, to hell with you. This is non-constructive, it does not get our message across, and it condemns us to a permanent minority status. Baruch Spinoza also once wrote that I've made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them. And that is what interfaith work sets out to do, to give people the opportunity to understand their differences. This doesn't mean that we should wallpaper over or whitewash or ignore our differences. They're very important, but we should be looking for the common ground too. In a divisive, conflict-driven world, it can be harder to find, but I think for those reasons it's that much more important that we seek to find it. I don't know that a world without religion would be any more or any less conflict-based, but I want to address the root of the problem that, as far as I see it, which is this tribalistic us versus them, in-group, out-group kind of thinking, and that is what interfaith work sets out to do. I want to thank you for letting me share some of my story with you today. There's a sociologist that works at Harvard named Marshall Gans, and he says that stories are what enable us to communicate our values to one another. There's a psychologist named Dan P. McAdams who elaborates on this, saying narrative and story guides our behavior in every moment and frames not only how we see the past, but how we see ourselves in the future. This is why interfaith work starts with stories, and it's why I've started with mine. I hope I have the opportunity to hear some of yours. In the meantime, I want to leave you with a question. What future is it that these narratives provide us with a sense for the future, and what future will we imagine for ourselves and for the world? Is it this pessimistic narrative in which the religious and the secular will continuously come into conflict until one wins out, where religion is nothing more than a problem to be eradicated? In the words of Eboo Patel, a man I've worked very closely with, will we make religion, which already is a bomb of destruction and a barrier of division, will we make it that, or can we make it an opportunity for a conversation, a bridge of cooperation? I think we can make the latter happen, and I've seen it with my own eyes, but we have to start by listening to more stories and then acting together on the shared values that they communicate. Thank you.